Hi everyone, we're going to try something new today. We're going to use some new software and try to teach you about how to create the perfect seam. First off, what's the difference between a 1/4 inch seam and a scant 1/4 inch seam? Actually, we might want to even step back farther than that. So for those of you that are new to sewing, most quilting patterns use a regular a standard, I guess I should say, standard 1/4 inch seam. Many of the newer patterns, I guess, are coming out and they say that they want a scant 1/4 inch seam. So what's the difference between a 1/4 inch seam and a scant 1/4 inch seam? Well, the catch is that when you put together two fabrics and you sew them together and then open them up with your seam, you've taken up, the thread has taken up some of the width of the seam, and now your seam has become bigger than 1/4 inch. Because when you open this now, your short or your seam is more than 1/4 inch, and therefore the pieces that you're working with are going to be smaller just a little bit than they should be. And if you do this repeatedly over and over and over through a quilt, and you have a lot of seams, it could make a difference in the size of your project and in how your seams all meet. So let's start with first, how do you get a 1/4 inch seam? Well, on your machine, you need to learn some of the buttons on your machine. So let's take a look at my machine. I have a Janome 6700, and when I turn on my machine, it will start with a setting of a stitch width of 4.5 and a stitch length of 2.4. And it tells me to use foot A, which is just a regular open-toed foot. Well, kind of open-toed. Anyways, that is not the foot that I traditionally use, because my machine came with this foot, which is called a 1/4 inch foot. And if I flip this a little bit, you can see, let me see if you can see this. There is a little lip right here, and this lip helps keep your fabric at just the right spot. So this 1/4 inch foot, it has an O label, and I can easily put it on my machine. And then what I do for my machine is I push number 4, which changes my screen up here to a 1/4 inch setting. And my 1/4 inch settings have an 8.3 stitch width and a 1.8 stitch length. Now, that is perfect for a 1/4 inch. And one way you can check that is by using one of these things. This is, let me put this behind here. This is a sewing machine seam guide, and it has holes in it at 3/4 inch, 5/8 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/8 inch, and 1/4 inch. So what you do is you take your seam guide, you carefully put it underneath your foot, and then you try to slowly insert the needle into the 1/4 inch slot. Then when you drop the foot, the side of the foot should be right along the edge of this ruler, which it is. So you can see that when my machine is set to number 4 and it's set at 8.3 stitch width and 1.8 stitch length, that I have a perfect 1/4 inch seam. Okay, but what if you don't have a Janome 6700? All right, well, that's when you might want to take a look and get one of these little handy dandy seam guides and see where you need to move your needle to make this work. Now, what you can do is, if it's not in the right spot, you can come over here to your stitch width, okay? And then you can, like mine is a dial, and it changes on my computer screen right here, and you want to move it so that your needle is moving to the right. So you move it over a couple and then you try again to see if your seam is going to be 1/4 of an inch. The other thing is that if you want a scant 1/4 inch, so like I said, what happens is when you're sewing and you sew 2 pieces of fabric together and you have a width, you have a seam in there, you have a thread, then you open the seam up or the fabric up and you iron it. Now you're a little bit, like maybe, I don't know, 2 threads wide is being taken up by that fold and by the width of the thread. So some patterns ask you to create what's called a scant 1/4 inch seam. In this pattern that we're working with, the JoJo pattern, GE Designs asks us to always use a scant 1/4 inch. Okay, so how do you get a scant 1/4 inch? Well, the next part that I'll show you will help you figure out what your 1/4 inch setting is and what your scant 1/4 inch setting is. So you'll need some scraps of fabric, and I suggest getting 3 pieces that are 2.5 inches wide, and they don't need to be very long. I don't know, these are 2.5 inches wide and there might be 4 inches long. Okay, but you need 3 of them. Okay, so get 3 of them. And then what you're going to do is you're going to sew them together, one to each other, so that you have 3 in a row. Okay, after you sew them together, I want you to press the seams one way or the other. And now you have these 3 strips all together. Now, each one of these started at 2.5 inches. If I took a 1/4 inch off of this fabric and on this side, and a 1/4 inch off on this side, 1/4 and 1/4 is a half. That means that on the right side of the fabric, from this seam to this seam should be 2 inches. Okay, so let's take a look. Oh, I don't know if you're going to be able to see that. If I put this down, and I'm not at a very flat surface right now, but I did it over on my other table, and I can see that this lines up perfect. I have the 8-inch line perfectly on the seam here and the 6-inch line perfectly on the seam here. So I have a perfect scant 1/4 inch. I got that though because I moved my stitch width knob over a little bit. And I have tinkered with it, and I know that if I move mine to 8.6, then it's in the perfect spot. You need to practice. So I suggest get yourself some of these scraps, 3 scraps. Sew them all together, press your seams out, measure from seam to seam the middle block. If you get exactly a 2-inch seam, then you have found your scant 1/4. Because when you do it with a true 1/4 inch, your seam is actually, what's left in there is actually going to be a little bit less than 2 inches. Less or more, now that I'm thinking about it. It's going to be a little bit less than 2 inches because your seam is actually bigger. Okay? So take those 3 pieces of fabric, sew them together, open the seams or iron the seams out, measure the inner strip. And your goal is to get a 2-inch strip on the center. You're going to have to keep playing with your stitch width knob until you find that perfect spot. And then write it down. Or put a piece of tape on your machine. Or take some of your ruler stickers and mark where you need it to go. I took an index card and I wrote on it where I want my numbers to be for the scant seam, but write it down. If you need to, write down where a scant is and where a regular is. It depends on your machine. We will talk about this tomorrow night at the class. But if you watch this ahead of time, I think then we can have a better discussion about what you need. If you have a Janome machine and you're curious about how to do it, then I would suggest calling the shop on Tuesday and see if Diane and Greg can talk you through it. Or tomorrow night we'll talk about it. We also do have 1/4-inch foots for the Janomes and the Elnas, if you're looking into one of those. But we can talk about it some more, but I want you to think about and look at your machine maybe today or tomorrow and figure out if you can find your perfect scant 1/4-inch seam. And a scant 1/4-inch seam will give you exactly a 2-inch strip in the center of 3 2.5-inch strips. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow.